Welcome to the debate. Imagine handing two identical school districts the exact same challenge, right? A student population with a 100% poverty rate. To one district, you give roughly $17,000 per student, and to the other, barely $9,000. I mean, common sense and decades of educational theory says the well-funded school wins that matchup every single time. But in reality, the school with half the money is vastly outperforming the other.
Yeah, it completely upends the conventional wisdom. We are looking at a comparative case study from April 2026 analyzing two school districts in Ohio, Steubenville and Youngstown. And it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Exactly. The core question we're looking at is this: does more money actually produce better academic results, or is the efficient allocation of resources and, systemic accountability the true catalyst for academic achievement? I look at this data and I argue that Steubenville's high performance on a significantly lower budget proves that instructional effectiveness matters far more than just raw funding.
Right? And I look at this exact same data and argue that celebrating Steubenville's efficiency masks a critical shared failure in actual student growth. Because lower funding might buy you a nice-looking baseline, but it still leaves high-poverty students fundamentally shortchanged in the long run.
So if you're listening to this and doing the math in your head, the contrast really is staggering. Let's just lay out the baseline data first. We have Youngstown, which the report basically positions as a classic inefficiency model. They are spending $16,984 per pupil. That is about 86% more than Steubenville, which is spending just $9,128 per student.
Yeah, almost double the investment per child.
Almost a double. And yet, despite that massive financial advantage, Youngstown ranks in the bottom 10 to 20% of districts statewide. I mean, they fall completely below state proficiency benchmarks in reading and math.
Right.
Meanwhile, Steubenville, operating on that incredibly lean $9,000 budget, ranks in the top 10 to 20% of Ohio districts. They are meeting their annual English language arts and math goals. They scored 7 out of 7 points on both of those state metrics. They have a strong graduation rate, pulling 6 out of 6 points. So, the conclusion seems inescapable to me. Youngstown is suffering from misaligned spending and weak leadership, while Steubenville proves that high performance at a low cost is absolutely possible if your system is tightly managed.
Well, the baseline metrics list Steubenville look fantastic on a state dashboard. I completely concede that. But, and this is a big but, if we dig into the report's critical insights section, we see a glaring, fundamental weakness shared by both of these districts. And it revolves around one concept, which is student growth. We really need to pause and explain the difference between proficiency and growth, because it's kind of the entire ballgame here.
Go ahead, lay it out.
So, proficiency is a static bar. It just asks, did this fourth grader pass the fourth grade math test? Growth, on the other hand, is longitudinal. It asks, how much did this specific child actually learn from September to June?
Right, the actual progress.
Exactly. Did they make a full year's worth of cognitive progress? Or, better yet, did they make a year and a half of progress to catch up? Because when we look at Steubenville's growth metrics, they scored a 0 out of 7 in reading growth, literally 0, and a 1 out of 7 in math growth.
Which, that sounds contradictory at first glance. How do you get 7 out of 7 in proficiency, but a 0 in growth?
Because of how districts often optimize for these state tests. If a district is highly efficient, they know exactly how to target the bubble kids, the students hovering just a few points below the passing line. You drill those specific kids, you get them over that minimum proficiency bar, and your district looks like a massive success on paper.
Right, you play the numbers.
Exactly. But the student who is profoundly behind, they stay behind. The gifted student who is already passing, they aren't challenged to grow further. So if Steubenville completely fails to accelerate learning over time, it hasn't actually solved the poverty education equation. It just optimized for a different, somewhat superficial metric. Framing them as a pure best practice model is deeply flawed when the students aren't actually growing year over year.
Okay, let's use an analogy here because I think it helps visualize what these two very different budgets are actually buying. Think of education funding and district management like constructing a building. Steubenville took their $9,000 per student and they built a perfectly solid, code-compliant foundation.
Okay.
They achieved a 57.4% gap closing score, meaning they are successfully closing the historical performance gaps between different demographics like race and income. They have a 99.6% testing participation rate. Their chronic absenteeism is controlled. They earn 5 out of 5 points there. The kids are in the building, they are safe, and the foundation is holding weight. Youngstown, on the other hand, bought premium materials for a skyscraper with their $17,000 per student, but they poured the foundation into a swamp of systemic dysfunction, so there's no building at all.
I actually like the building analogy, but let's follow it through. Steubenville built a solid foundation. Great. But they completely ran out of materials to build the upper floors. Well, no, really, think about it. A foundation is necessary, yes, but you can't live on a concrete slab forever. A 0 out of 7 in reading growth means that while the foundation is stable, these students are not climbing any higher. For students living in 100% poverty districts, they often start miles behind the starting line. Simply getting them to scrape over a minimum proficiency bar is not enough to change their life trajectory.
I hear you, but
They need accelerated growth to close the wealth and opportunity gap. So Steubenville's foundation might be a definitive victory compared to Youngstown's swamp, but it is not a victory for the student's long-term cognitive development.
But if we are trying to solve a crisis, and urban education in deep poverty is absolutely a crisis, we have to establish a baseline of operational competence first. Steubenville has achieved operational competence. They even have strong identification and services for gifted and advanced programs, which the report explicitly notes Youngstown lacks entirely. They have actual systems in place.
Sure, systems for baseline compliance.
Yes, but since we both agree that longitudinal growth is a massive challenge in both districts, the debate really has to shift to examining why Youngstown's massive budget isn't translating even to that concrete foundation. And the report gives us a staggering specific to look at. Youngstown spends $10,186 just on classroom instruction per pupil.
Right. Let's look at the internal financial breakdown.
If you're listening and wondering how a school spends over $10,000 on instruction and still fails basic reading and math, you aren't alone. The math is just wild. Youngstown spends more on just classroom instruction than Steubenville spends on its entire total per pupil budget of $9,128. Steubenville operates the whole district, buses, lights, teachers, administration, for less than Youngstown spends strictly on the classroom. That fact completely eviscerates the argument that Youngstown's failures are due to a lack of resources.
So what is happening to that $10,000?
It is a profound failure of execution. The text asserts that Youngstown suffers from weak instructional effectiveness and systemic cultural issues. How does a district squander that kind of money? Well, it happens through misaligned curriculum, buying expensive new reading programs, but failing to actually train the teachers on how to use them.
Yeah, the shiny object syndrome.
Exactly. It happens through high teacher turnover, which forces the district to constantly spend money recruiting and retraining rather than refining practice. It's weak principal leadership failing to hold classrooms to rigorous standards. When you are putting $10,000 per kid directly into the classroom and they are still at the bottom of the state, it is purely a failure of management, not a failure of funding.
Look, Youngstown's financial waste in the classroom is indefensible. I will absolutely concede that. But we have to look at the rest of the ledger to understand the reality these two districts are facing, because poverty is not a single uniform experience. Let's direct our attention to the non-classroom spending.
Okay.
In Youngstown, it's $6,799 per pupil. In Steubenville, it's half that, $3,333. And look at the federal funding. Youngstown receives $1,627 per student, compared to Steubenville's $698. Now, why does a district receive vastly more federal funds and spend vastly more on non-classroom items?
Well, the report categorizes this under the inefficiency model
Because it's a high investment in support services that yields a frankly terrible academic return.
But we have to ask why those support services are needed in the first place and what that money is actually buying. Federal funds, like Title I money, are largely allocated based on specific, severe community needs. What does non-classroom spending actually look like? It looks like hiring a fleet of social workers. It looks like running specialized transportation for homeless students.
Right, wraparound services.
Exactly. It's funding wraparound community services, free meal programs, trauma counselors, and enhanced security like metal detectors. The fact that Youngstown's non-classroom and federal numbers are so much higher suggests that they are facing a deeper, more severe type of community crisis.
Even though both are officially designated as 100% poverty?
Yes, because poverty is not a monolith. A district with a high population of stable working-class families who happen to fall just below the poverty line operates very differently than a district experiencing, acute urban decay, rampant housing instability, and neighborhood violence.
Sure, the contexts are different.
Right, and the manifestations of trauma in a place like Youngstown might require massive, expensive interventions just to get kids to physically walk through the front doors. Comparing their budgets directly as if they are operating in identical socioeconomic environments just because the state slaps a 100% poverty label on both is a false equivalence.
I see your point. But if Youngstown's massive non-classroom spending was actually functioning as a necessary support system for community trauma, we would see it reflected in the data. Specifically, we would see it in getting kids to school, but we don't. The report explicitly highlights Steubenville's controlled absenteeism. They scored 5 out of 5 points there.
True.
Youngstown, on the other hand, has, and I quote, major challenges with attendance. They are spending nearly $7,000 per kid outside the classroom, supposedly on these wraparound supports, and the kids still aren't showing up. This tells me the money isn't mitigating trauma, it's just disappearing into an inefficient bureaucracy.
Or the trauma is so profound that even $7,000 isn't enough to counteract what happens when the school day ends.
I think assuming the trauma is just insurmountable inadvertently justifies a system that fails the very students you're pointing out are vulnerable. And, this leads directly to the policy implications of the study and the report's ultimate call to action, which I think is the most crucial part of this entire analysis. The report states unequivocally, we are not underfunding failure, we are overfunding systems that are not working.
The overfunding failure narrative. This is where we get into very dangerous territory.
It is a powerful, necessary truth. If educational advocates, groups like the Urban League, the NAACP, local community leaders, if they want to center Black student achievement and lift up impoverished neighborhoods, they must audit these high-spending, low-performing districts and demand accountability tied directly to academic outcomes.
I agree with accountability, but
We cannot keep throwing money at a machine that is broken and pretending we are providing an intervention. We have to replicate the best academic practice models. Steubenville proves that efficient resource allocation, strong principal leadership, and a strict focus on instructional effectiveness can conquer the statistical disadvantages of poverty. We have to demand that Youngstown adopts Steubenville's systems.
I agree entirely that Youngstown needs urgent restructuring. We cannot defend their mismanagement. But the phrasing, we are not underfunding failure, we are overfunding systems that are not working, that is highly flammable rhetoric. And I warn against weaponizing this data.
Weaponizing it how?
By labeling Steubenville the definitive winner in return on investment, you risk handing a loaded gun to policymakers who want to slash public school funding across the board. Put yourself in a state legislative session. A lawmaker looks at this comparative case study. They see that Steubenville achieved state proficiency standards on $9,128 per student.
Right, they proved it can be done.
Yes, and the immediate political reaction is going to be, great, that's the new baseline. Cut everyone's budget down to 9. Steubenville proved that for all you need. But look at the logical trap there. If $9,000 only buys you 0 growth in reading, well, the conclusion should not be that $9,000 is enough.
But it buys proficiency. It buys a 6 out of 6 graduation rate. It buys a system that actually functions day to day.
It buys a system that meets a static standard, but fails to elevate the student's cognitive trajectory over time. The conclusion we should draw is that money without effective execution is absolutely wasted. Youngstown proves that.
but effective execution still needs adequate funding to generate actual year-over-year student growth. Efficiency doesn't mean starvation.
Nobody is saying we should starve them.
But that's how the data gets used. Imagine if you took Steubenville's highly efficient accountability system, their strong culture, their attendance protocols, and you gave them the resources to actually hire specialized reading interventionists, to lower class sizes from 30 down to 15, to provide high-dosage one-on-one tutoring. Maybe then you see that 0 in reading growth turn into a 7. By championing Steubenville as the ceiling of what we should aim for, we are implicitly agreeing that low-income students don't deserve the resources required for actual academic acceleration. Okay, I don't think the report is arguing that Steubenville is the ceiling. It's arguing that Steubenville is the floor. It is the operational floor we should demand before we start writing blank checks to failing districts. The whole point of this document is to inspire stakeholders to move beyond entrenched assumptions, which are what, exactly?
Well, for decades, the assumption has always been that high poverty requires exorbitant funding to even make a dent in achievement. Steubenville shatters that assumption entirely. They are operating at roughly $3,600 below the state average per pupil, and they are outperforming some of the wealthiest suburban districts in Ohio. That is a testament to school leadership, to a culture of high expectations, and to ensuring that the $5,795 they do spend on classroom instruction is utilized with surgical precision.
Surgical precision that yields limited to no growth. We simply cannot gloss over that mechanism. How does a highly efficient school get 0 growth? They hyperfixate on the state tests. The danger of the efficiency model is that it almost always relies on rote memorization, rigid compliance, and maximizing dashboard metrics at the expense of deep, expansive learning.
That's a bit of an assumption about their pedagogy.
It's what happens when you have to squeeze every drop of blood from a stone. Are they fostering critical thinking? Are they teaching complex problem solving? Or are they just drilling the test format until the kids can pass it in their sleep? Youngstown is clearly failing. It is an intervention model that needs immediate, aggressive reform. But if we audit Youngstown and just try to copy-paste Steubenville's budget constraints onto them, we will fail those students all over again.
But the goal isn't to copy-paste the budget constraints. No one is saying we need to take money away from Youngstown. The goal is to copy-paste the accountability and the instructional focus. The report's call to action is to demand accountability tied to outcomes. If Youngstown had Steubenville's leadership, their curriculum alignment, and their attendance tracking, even with Youngstown's current level of funding, imagine what they could achieve.
All the potential would be massive. I agree.
Right. The tragedy here isn't just that Steubenville might need more money to eventually achieve longitudinal growth. The real immediate tragedy is that Youngstown has the money to achieve growth right now, today, and it is being squandered through systemic inefficiencies. They have the resources for the one-on-one tutors and the reading specialists, and the kids still can't read.
On that, we are in complete agreement. The systemic performance gaps in Youngstown are a true crisis. A $16,000 per pupil budget should be yielding incredible results, and the fact that it isn't is a profound failure of adult leadership. But we must hold two truths simultaneously as we evaluate this research.
Which are?
High funding alone does not magically produce academic success, and highly efficient low funding does not necessarily produce academic growth. The strategic analysis here is incomplete if we just declare Steubenville the undisputed winner of resource allocation effectiveness.
Well, as we look to wrap up this analysis, I think we have clearly mapped the complex contours of this data. We've looked at the money, the test scores, and the daily reality of these two districts. For my part, the evidence in this 2026 case study undeniably breaks the myth that funding alone equals achievement. Leadership and a relentless focus on instructional practice can conquer the statistical disadvantages of 100% poverty rate to successfully meet state standards. It provides a blueprint for what baseline operational success looks like and proves we don't need to wait for endless funding to start helping students succeed.
And I would summarize by agreeing that Youngstown's high-cost, low-result model requires urgent, immediate intervention from the state or community leaders. However, I maintain that Steubenville's zero-growth metrics show we still have not found a model that truly accelerates learning for impoverished students. Efficiency is not the same as equity.
That's a fair distinction.
Building a solid foundation is vital,
But meeting a minimum standard on a state test should not be the finish line for our most vulnerable communities. We must demand effective, accountable systems, yes, but we must also demand the sustained resources necessary for actual, continuous, year-over-year cognitive growth.
There is clearly much more to explore in this material, and both of these districts offer vital, data-driven foundations for a much-needed conversation about systemic alignment in our public schools. We invite everyone listening to dive into the data themselves and consider the daily realities these communities face.
It really comes down to what we value most when we look at the health of a public school system.
Exactly. It brings us right back to our building analogy. We all want a straightforward answer. We want to see a broken system fixed with a clear, expensive intervention, or we want to point to a lean, efficient system and declare the problem solved. But the reality of education, especially in high poverty areas, is far more complex than a simple binary. We leave you with this to ponder. When we evaluate the ultimate success of a school, should achieving baseline proficiency be the goal we celebrate, or is a system failing until it guarantees continual year-over-year growth for every single student?
And what happens to a generation of students if we optimize for one metric while completely ignoring the other?
Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time.